I'm just going to add some small notes. They're not that important, but I was just thinking about it, and I know it does sort of add some complexity or some more levels of the inner workings of the different kinds of narcissists. So I think the main difference, well, not the main difference, no, but another difference between, for example, an inverted narcissist, I should rather say covert narcissist, of which an inverted narcissist is a kind of covert narcissist, and a malignant narcissist is that a malignant narcissist is self-sympathizing primarily, and although they do like to extract support for their self-sympathy, they kind of want a moral support for their self-sympathy. They want it to be respected, but I don't think that the form of narcissistic supply that they obtain from other people is sympathy. Although, I mean, you know, in as much as that they can translate it into the kind of respect and adulation which they want in that kind of collateral support, I mean, maybe sympathy will do. But I do think that a stark distinction can be made where a covert narcissist is specifically looking for a kind of collateral sympathy, and they because they don't generate their own sympathy. They generate complaints, but they don't generate their own sympathy. So they need actually someone else to provide that sort of emotion. And then the kind of the borderline narcissists, it's strange because on this theme, it's I think weirdly inconsistent, because they don't sympathize with themselves. They have a more, it's not an emotional self-sympathy, it's more like a rationalization of their own need for something external, and they don't want what they get from the external sort of collateral support which they garner and they sort of manipulate and generate through their design of something, or is that they actually want to see some kind of sadistic, they want to see effort being done, and then they can kind of translate that in their mind into a kind of into something that's like a pseudo sympathy. So it's like sympathizing with their narrative in some sense, but it's more of a rationalization on their part. It's more of a it's more like maintaining a system. So what else can be said about that? So it's strange that in some obtuse way you can see that the borderline case is actually more parasitic in its dependency on sympathy from other people, but it's not the sympathy that provides the security. about this for a second and try to encapsulate it into a better summary. But yeah, I mean, on the theme of sympathy, it doesn't actually sort of track well with the borderline mechanism. It's not a sort of integral part. It's more of the strategy. It's like one of the components of a strategy that is part of a kind of which is a secondary issue, essentially, to securing the regulation or maintenance of the borderlines sort of web of a kind of a dependable system. So it's more like a kind of it's weird because the borderline really is much more focused on manipulation and having that sense of control, and so sympathy can be a means to having that kind of dependable control, but it's not the only sort of strategy. It's not the only sort of viable thing. I mean, I think what's especially crude about borderlines is they're only limited by their own sort of immediacy of self-gratification, of the compulsion that they feel to feel in control, and so that they have a sort of a stable narcissistic supply and sort of complementary support structure that facilitates their narcissistic supply. But apart from that kind of tenuousness or temperamental kind of weakness that they have, that is the only limiting factor as to the scope and the variety of different strategies that they can employ. I mean, you can get borderlines that are using very complicated forms of manipulation, not simultaneously in the immediate moment, but simultaneously going on with the different interpersonal connections that they have, so it's more important to them that they lay down a kind of a web, and so this kind of spider can have more than one web laid out and spun at the same time, and each of those webs are perhaps even vastly contradictory to one another, that the mechanics of one web, there's almost it's sort of a parcel of a cognitive dissonance waiting to happen, but obviously they don't care about consistency, they care about manipulation. They care about the reliability of the manipulation, not the internal coherence and internal consistency. And so, they have this natural and reflexive ability to sort of channel what is needed emotionally in order to maintain that support structure, to call it that. So sympathy, it doesn't really come into it. So I mean, I would actually argue that the borderlines are actually probably very similar to the malignant narcissists, and I think there are also actually malignant narcissists might primarily be somewhat borderline, where they are, but I would say that borderlines that are not full-blown malignant narcissists are almost like half-formed malignant narcissists, or rather, let me just describe the difference, is that they both have a an absolute sense of self-sympathy. In fact, the malignant narcissist has actually made that self-sympathy more vulnerable to their environmental influence. And so the concept of sympathy has their own internal concept of sympathy, which they furnish to themselves in their self-regard, just requires a kind of collateral respect from their environment, which they want to extract from others in the form of narcissistic abuse and just disorientation or whatever form it may come in, and even a malignant narcissist has almost the entire toolkit, whereas the borderline has weirdly, I mean, in some sense they have the same variety of toolkit available to them, but they are more impetuous and more prone to using cheap, fast, and expedient means that will somehow work reliably, perhaps more in the short term and medium term, and not so much in the long term. So they're more like locusts, you know. They can really create themselves as a plague on you know, and almost deplete tolerance of their tactics, you know. So whereas malignant narcissists, and I guess they're both the same actually on this, because, you know, like, it really depends on, I mean, malignant narcissists, I think, are more capable of planning their malignancy to be somewhat more sustainable in some sense. But, you know, maybe it's like it's a longer fuse, but when it actually sort of is not able to be when it eventually runs out, and the sort of and the regulation is not there, it's sort of it's a bigger explosion. Again, I feel like I can't even say that, because borderlines, I think, well, I guess, you know, it's just a different form of explosion in some sense, where malignant narcissists will potentially cross any line, you know, can do very frightening psychopathic things if their narcissistic supply is threatened, let's just say, in a fundamental way, because that will be more existentially felt, whereas the borderline has always got this immediate existential kind of angst, is sort of much more temperamental, and so they might literally throw a more turbulent tantrum. But the malignant narcissist is capable of doing, you know, I mean, the borderline is potentially also capable of doing very harsh things, but it's sort of more in the heat of the moment. But it is interesting, because the borderline will perhaps even harm themselves to an extent, in order to facilitate the kind of the web of control, to re-establish that web of control. And, you know, and they might not just do it to themselves, they could also threaten, they could also do anything, you know, any form of main sort of difference is. I mean, there's obviously there's a huge crossover, and I'm just trying to think of sort of a theme on sympathy that kind of summarizes the distinctness. It is strange, because I think that on some level the malignant narcissist makes their what was I calling it? Their self-sympathy as part of their their self-regard is in general more stable, but specifically when it's threatened, it becomes much more fierce and calculating in its response. Whereas the borderline is weird, because it also has this absolute sense of self-sympathy, but it is willing to almost, it is actually a conscious deception. It is willing to pretend that it needs other people's emotional energy to supplement that sympathy, or to bolster that sympathy, or to validate that sympathy, and to actually be the one that is externally providing the sympathy, which is, it's not actually true, but it is basically the drama that they enact, because it gives them it playing that in their persona, their mask, their social mask, their interpersonal mask, how they appear to other people. That particular tactic of treating other people as if they depend on their sympathy, which they in fact do not need from other people. They just actually want control of them. But what affords them that control is the game of pretending, effectively. So yeah, the borderline uses this pretense to conceal its its narcissistic chicanery. I think is the proper use of that word. And so the borderline personality is actually toying with the idea of giving other people a role in their internal autism of self-regard and self-sympathy, but that is really just a kind of the general overarching mechanism, which then is deployed via various different strategies, which, as I've even said, can be strategies that the person is maintaining in their mind simultaneously as those strategies are even internally incoherent, or rather internally inconsistent with each other. They use different forms of rationalism, which actually contradict on the actual issues involved. They will, which is also why sometimes borderline personality disordered people, they have different friend circles, and they have to keep them quite separate, because they're telling a different story, they're spinning a different yarn in each of those places. It's interesting as well, because there's a huge parallel between that kind of personality style and even certain political ideologies and organizations. like the Ku Klux Klan and fascistic politics in general, has this kind of cognitive dissonance in terms of how they deal with issues, and it's all to maintain the in-group, out-group sort of narrative that's part of the kind of the web. I'm going to get into identity politics. Because I've actually written out some responses to people, and that dialogue essentially that I'm going to read out is I think going to be much more interesting in dealing with some of these themes and issues, and sort of deal with it directly on the nose. So it is interesting that effectively how the borderline is I do think that it's a form of narcissism primarily, that it's more narcissism than it is borderline. And what it effectively is, I must think about that, because there are some manifestations of borderline which don't seem narcissistic. Okay, I'll get into that. I think that is explained in this way, that effectively, because the borderline is creating a kind of toy vehicle of interpersonal connection. They're creating a way in which that they can communicate with the outside world. They're creating a kind of a switchboard which other external players or actors can correlate to their internal sort of absolute self-sympathy and self-regard. And they do that effectively by creating this toy scenario where they pretend as if they depend on other people to provide that sympathy. So they've kind of got like, it really is based on a kind of compartmentalization where they've got abstractly, ideally, they are this absolute narcissist, and then they've got this further duplication of their worldview, which gets created as a sort of as a translation. Of their internal narcissistic values that are essentially being tested externally. They're not being tested in a vulnerable sense. Test is probably the wrong word. They're getting trotted out externally in a way that's almost slightly self-deprecating of that kind of internal narcissistic state. It's kind of like, it's almost an ironic trotting out. It's an ironic test run, essentially. And it's probably justified internally as out of pure boredom. This is why you can often get borderlines who get incredibly hysterical and emotional, that effectively, if you pierce through their gaslighting and you don't let them concoct and convolute and if you just kind of see through them, and they know that everyone that forms part of their peanut gallery, that forms part of their audience, is not buying it because there's someone that has a stronger narrative that has literally tracked all of their bad faith and their inconsistency. If you're capable of essentially breaking the spider web down in front of their eyes, after the tears, after the hysterical, kind of drama that they put themselves through, there's actually a very cool, calculating individual behind that. But it'll never show itself if they essentially have a hope of catching a fly in the web. They have to literally see the web burn down. They have to have someone that is actually has the sort of the vision to see through it in real time, and then they can actually see that this person is seeing through it in real time, and that they don't have any form of collateral support that they can depend on, that they can use to insulate themselves, or use as a human shield. You know, they don't have any hostage taking that's active and deployable that they can use as a diversion. And, you know, when that stuff comes down, you know, I mean, it really is quite pathetic, because at the end of the day, the reason why they do this to themselves is effectively because they don't have another means to connect with anything else external, apart from this very strange game of bad faith and manipulation and control. So everything is raw. I mean, borderlines are actually, you know, they're playing chess, but their pieces that they're playing with are their own emotional state, you know. So they have to create these very sophisticated scenarios of their own feeling that make them, you know, and this is why they're very hard to tolerate, to be around, because they're just inconsistent. You know, the kind of the cognitive dissonance is very annoying, essentially, to have to tolerate, and to have to and be forced to follow their very strange forms of rationalization, which work on a superficial level, but if you actually, you know, if you look any deeper, the whole thing is just a complete sham. And so, you know, their lives are effectively fragments of these inconsistent narratives that if ever integrated, you know, you're not dealing with a human being. You're dealing with a hollow psychopathic vampire. And their capacity for destruction and for, you know, sort of abuse, the narcissistic abuse, you know, which a borderline mother can wreak, can have wrought on her children, is I mean, it is also interesting, because I would argue that might be how we get some of our geniuses, because having to tolerate and sort of survive that kind of narcissistic abuse without being imprinted by it does create a certain amount of internal integrity and character, because that's essentially what borderlines require to survive. They need other people's integrity to tap, because if other people aren't willing to be accountable, to be responsible, they will just literally doom spiral. They need to sort of leech off of other people's accountability. They need to externalize responsibility for their own, for the consequences of their own actions. I mean, I think one of the best ways of actually describing it is that nothing that they do is in fact, they won't even do something until they have found a way to make somebody else responsible for the outcome. So, you know, it's almost like creating the right set of cues and getting and extracting the right kind of words, because then those words can be rearranged into an argument after the fact, so that they will have guaranteed a certain outcome. So it's like their expectations become their crystallized covert contract. But they do wear people down, because those contracts are so those contracts are just how they are generated and sustained, or even how they are laid down, are so pathological. They require so much doublespeak and deception and irrationality, and a kind of it ends up having to all depend on the expectations, the subjective expectation. Everything has to live through the subjective expectation of the borderline person themselves. Everyone has to constantly sympathize with their expectations that they generated. And so because everyone is always constantly being made responsible to their expectations, you have to actively constantly try to minimize their expectations and to notice when they are being implied or instigated, and that can create a kind of a hypervigilance, which can be part of intelligence, or laying down some level of analytical filtration system. I mean, if you internalize it, you're going to be completely fucked. You're going to be a psychotic wreck. It is interesting, because I believe Hitler was probably a child of, or one of his caretakers. Anyway, can I say anything else? I don't think I've contradicted myself. I think the borderline I mean, I guess that does sound a slight contradiction, that the borderline demand sympathy, or will do everything to extract sympathy for their expectations, but that sympathy is meant to be somewhat like a dim, pale reflection of the internal sympathy, but the internal sympathy is completely insulated. It's an isolated. These are working in parallel. They're not connected. So the internal machine of narcissism is being mimicked externally in this game. And it's probably not even that important to them that they get the sympathy relative to that internal system of narcissism, because they, in some sense, already, as long as they make a good enough argument, they don't even have to say, okay, I actually got what I wanted. That's not even, like, in terms of what causes the internal validation, which is pretty much absolute. It's already won. They just have to be able to make the argument that the person should have conceded, that they lost too much, for instance, by not conceding to their manipulation and control. You know, if they have a good enough control spider web, it doesn't so much matter if they come out richer or poorer, so much as that there is a consequence which is predicted and administered by the control web. And so as long as someone paid the price according to their expectation, like, so you can defy them, but as long as it didn't come, as long as you didn't get away scot-free, that's good enough. As long as they made your life horrible enough, you know, this is why you get so many women who lay false rape charges, for instance. Is all forms part of these kinds of mechanics, the kind of the vindictiveness, because that is all they need, essentially, to be winning the external game. It's not a kind of absolute win-win sort of thing. Anyway, I think I've described enough of this stuff.